Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to the last class discussion for HIST 374, Africa and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. From the beginning of the semester, we've been discussing how the transatlantic slave trade got started, what led to it starting, and Africans in the Americas, some of the injustices that they've been facing, and people in the diaspora, and also Africans in the diaspora and the year of return. So today we're gonna end our class with a discussion on reparations, HR Bill 40, and also talking about the year of return for people of African descent, which was last year from 1619 to 2019, became 400 years, for the transatlantic slave trade. So today we have a guest speaker in the person of Dr. Akil Khalfani. He's the director of the Africana Institute at Essex County College, and he's here to discuss with us today. So you have the floor, Professor Khalfani. Welcome. Let's give him a round of applause.
Yes, a virtual applause.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. I'm glad to be here, and I'm honored to be a guest in your class, Professor. And I look forward to a discussion with your students and others who may join. So let me just give a little more background about who I am, and a little background on some of the. I want to address the title and theme of the class, actually. So I'll do that in this kind of introductory thing. So as you said, I'm a professor of sociology and African studies at Essex County College. I also I lived in South Africa for a little while. I've studied at University of Pennsylvania, and I wrote a book called The Hidden Debate, which looks at affirmative action in South Africa and the United States, as well as contributed to an Introduction to Sociology textbook, and a couple other things. But the main thing here I want to emphasize is that when we look at the very title of your class, the Transatlantic Slave Trade, that I want us to first think about that there was no Atlantic Ocean that enslaved people, right? So that I first start off with saying that we've got to look at this as the European slave trade, right? Because that's really what it was. I think we have a mischaracterization of the impact of the slave trade when we talk about it in ways that we depersonalize it. We take it away from those who were the tormentors of Africans who were taken into slavery, right? Those who were impacted by the ideas of expansion, control, and domination at the hands of European colonists. And so that we have to recontextualize our discussions on those things. And oftentimes, whether I'm campaigning or I am, speaking of campaigning, I just ran for US Congress in New Jersey. But whether I'm campaigning or I'm teaching classes, I want to make sure that folks are clear on the history that we're talking about, and how it happened, and who were the perpetrators and who was accosted in the process. So that when we're looking at this idea of slavery, of those folks who were enslaved, our ancestors who were enslaved, we've got to put it in context of saying that we first have to humanize them, right? And that the people who were enslaved were fathers and mothers and daughters and sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles. They were artisans, they were farmers, they were warriors. Some of them were princes and chiefs and queen mothers. So they all had different kinds of statuses in society. And we need to contextualize their status in the backdrop of what it was that was going on, right? So that we understand, we talk about this 1619 to 2019, that we put that in a particular kind of context, that that analysis also is a little bit problematic, right? Because in addition to calling it the Atlantic slave trade or transatlantic slave trade, this transportation of human beings as capital, as cargo, as implements of industrialization, right? They were the implements of pre-industrialization, pre-industrial America, pre-industrial Europe, were the implements of the slave trade, and that we further depersonalized them by calling them slaves, right? So that they were enslaved, so that these fathers and mothers were enslaved, these sons and daughters were enslaved. And there's a sister who wrote a book. She's a historian. She lives in Newark. Her name is Nell Painter, and she's a historian who's written some really interesting works. One book she wrote is called the History of White People, and she wrote some other books on African American history and things of that nature. But this later book kind of gives us some context for understanding how the history of slavery and enslaving people transpired. And so this history of enslaving is clearly something that happened for thousands of years. This was a tradition in Europe and other places around the world, but that Europe was the one who enslaved, Europeans were the ones who enslaved Africans, that this was not unfamiliar to their practices in Europe itself. And so that coming to a place outside of Europe to continue the engagement in that type of a exchange and bondage, it was not unfamiliar. And when we think about that, then that helps us to think about the enslavement of Africans a little bit differently, right? Because that this was the next group of folks who they encountered that was a continuation of something they were already doing. In fact, before they tried to enslave Africans, they tried to enslave the indigenous population here in the Americas. So to look at this as 1692 to 1619 to 2019 is a little bit of a misrepresentation. That we've had a lot of discussion about this recently, because the trafficking of indigenous folks has been happening, or of people has been happening, particularly even with Africans, for a long time, right? So that you have, when Europeans first decided to circumnavigate the African coastline with Bartholomew Diaz and other folks, that they were already engaged in the usurpation of African hegemony in their efforts to find greener lands, in their efforts to find wealth, in their efforts to find places for their own prison population, in their efforts to find resources from India, whether it was markets for their own stuff, or to get seasonings and spices and herbs and other goods, other commodities. So that this whole pursuit of commodities for the advantage of capitalistic gain is at the heart of what happened with the slave market in what became the European slave trade, or what you're calling the transatlantic slave trade. When we look at this timeline, though, that's where the problem begins, right? Because you have the beginnings of that trade happening all the way back in the 1500s, the 1400s. Diaz traveled in the 1400s. Jan van Riebeck for the Dutch traveled all the way to South Africa in 1452 or 1457, somewhere around there. And that's when they set up the first colony, began to set up the first colony in South Africa. And so that occurred simultaneously with other things. And then they began to enslave the indigenous population on the continent itself. And so when we put the ideas of the slave trade, uh, the American slave trade, in context with what was going on around the world at the time, then we start looking at it slightly differently, right? This was when the Moors had run Spain and Portugal and part of Italy for 700 plus years, and the Spanish had just gotten control back of Spain when King Ferdinand and Queen, I believe Elizabeth, they had finally kicked out the Moors, and the Moors were a group of Islamicized Africans who ran Spain, well, really was no Portugal at the time, but Spain was today is Portugal, and part of Italy for 700 years. So you had a group of Africans who were bringing all kinds of technology there. So there was this pushback to first to Islam, right? They were Islamic. So there was this pushback to Islam and this pushback to these Africans who had invaded and taken over in part of Europe for such a long period of time. And so then that we also have to put that as part of the underbelly of this dialogue. You want to learn more about that? I suggest you look at a book by Stanley Lane Poole called The Moors of Africa. There's a couple other books on that. I think, who else wrote a book on that? I'll remember in a minute, but I can't remember right this second. But look up Stanley Lane Poole's book. It's a good book on that. But then we're getting back to all this discussion right now is trying to get us to understand, to contextualize the idea of 1619 to 2019 and give us background for having this dialogue, right? That if we're going to have that dialogue, my suggestion is that it needs to be a little more complete, a little more thorough, right? Because we have evidence that the Spanish were in the area which today is Florida all the way back in the 1500s. So if the Spanish were in Florida, then for whom are we looking at this Jamestown settlement in 1619, right? Or do we I don't even want to say credit, do we not acknowledge the impact of African enslavement by other Europeans, or do we only focus on the British, right? How early were the Dutch, right? Maybe some of you live in New York, right? Maybe most of you live in New York. And if you live in New York, what was New York called, right? What was New York called before it was New York? It was New Amsterdam, right? So therefore, the Dutch were here before the British for a brief time, but nonetheless, they were here. And so their presence is something we have to think about, right? What was the impact of their presence? And when we begin to start thinking about those things, it changes the way we look at, how we understand what became what we're talking about today, and that's this idea of this whole discussion about 1619, and the whole discussion about 1619 and what that means for Africans in America today, what that means for Europeans in America today, what that means for America today, and what it means in part is a denial of the further extent of the impact of racism and white supremacy on African people, on Native American people. And so then we have to recalibrate our thinking about this whole discussion. And not that the discussion and the newspaper expose in the New York Times didn't have some validity, but I suggest we need to put that within a wider kind of scope of things, and that gives us a better foundation on which to talk about the other things that are coming up later, which are dealing with reparations, dealing with the year of return. That we can't really adequately talk about those things, talk about the current situation between African Americans or people of African descent and Europeans in America, or the conflict that happens or that's happening between those groups of people. We've got to have a robust understanding of the impact. And when we develop that a more robust impact, we're going to get to a place where we can have a better dialogue. We're going to get to a place where we have a more honest dialogue. And that's what I really hope that we gain from this process, is one where we can talk about these things from a perspective that gives us a more holistic understanding of what happened, so that we have a more holistic approach to solutions. See, sometimes what happens, and as a sociologist, what I look at is one of my main things that I try to get us to address is holistic solutions to social problems. And to develop holistic solutions to social problems, we have got to see those things in ways that we are taking a holistic analysis of them, right? Uh, Even when we talk about 1619, the other part that's problematic in that discussion is that we haven't acknowledged the fact that African people have been in the Americas for 8,000 to 9,000 years, right? The archaeologists' most recent finds have demonstrated that uh, archaeological remains, that is bones of African people, have been found in Brazil and other parts of the Americas that are over 8,000 to 9,000 years old. So here again, we have to say, well, where did who are the indigenous people? Who are the Americans, right? Who are this population that that Christopher Columbus and others encountered, right? Christopher Columbus never landed in the United States, was today United States, but we honor him for one reason or another. I'm not really sure, right? I think that's a recalculation or a redrawing of history that's not accurate. And some people take issue with that, and I understand that. But I think that when we look at revisionist history, um, once again, we have to continue to dig. And part of that is that as we learn more information, then we have to correct the history books. We have to correct our understanding of things. And I'll give you a good example of that. There's a gentleman a brilliant scientist who runs uh, the um, the planetarium in New York. Gosh, why am I drawing a blank on his name all of a sudden? Uh, Anybody knows his name can throw it up real quick. Uh, he Anyway, he speaks all around the world, and so the Hayden Planetarium, and I'll remember his name in a second. But when he was redesigning the planetarium, what he decided to do, what he and his colleagues came up with, was that the idea that Pluto was no longer a planet, right? That Pluto was a subplanet or a minor planet, so it didn't merit being um, uh, discussed and presented at the same time as the other planets, right? And so what he did was that he completely removed it from the from the whole presentation of the other planets. So now we went from 9 to 8 planets, and there was an uproar about it. But in the end, him with his discussion and all the other scientists, he won the discussion, and they installed the new exhibition, and that's what we use for 10, 15. Now there's new discussion about that now today, but for 10 or 15 years, or maybe even more, that um, the Hayden Planetarium was seen as a place that there was only 9, and then they began to teach that around the globe, right? So the point is that as we have new discoveries, and we have anthropological discoveries, we have DNA discoveries, we have biological discoveries, we have archaeological discoveries, we have linguistic discoveries, we have social scientific discoveries, and each of these things helps us to see and understand the world differently. And he presented to us that we should see the world differently, and so that here we have a case where we're looking the uh, looking at the history of enslavement and saying that we need to be looking at it differently. Why? Because we have new information, and that's how we get to the place of doing that. And once we're Neil deGrasse Tyson, that's what it is. I had to look him up. I couldn't remember. The beauty of internet and phones. So that's what Neil deGrasse Tyson did, though, is he came up with this different idea. And so then these other anthropologists came up with a different idea because they had new evidence, right? The geneticists came up with new evidence. They said that all humankind began in Africa. That was built on top of what the archaeologists had already said, but they used the mitochondrial DNA to find that out, right? And so when we look at each of these things, we get new bits of information, new ways of seeing and understanding things. We add to it, so we become greater in our understanding of the world as we know it, and the world can potentially have a different impact on us because of that. So my point is that when we're looking at the impact of the European slave trade, and made me take a quick sidebar here. Another reason why I say the European slave trade is because we also have to put in context the impact on Africa by the Arab slave trade, right, which predates the European slave trade and was longer than the European slave trade, but different, right? So that the Arab slave trade uh, involved a lot of women, right? More women and children. Men were taken into the European slave trade, to the Arab slave trade, but they were often made into eunuchs. If you don't know what that is, please look it up. But in the European slave trade, Africans were chattel, right? They were property. They were seen no different as a cow or a wheelbarrow or a bag of grain. And so when we began to start looking at the impact of slavery, of enslavement of African people in that way, then that helps us to really recontextualize it, right? And we can see that there was different modalities of enslavement, different interactions of it as it went over the time. That is, that when you see the early periods are different than the later periods. The ways in which the Spanish and the French enslaved folks was different than the British and the Dutch. But nonetheless, the impact of treating people as chattel in the end becomes the same thing. So is 413. So let me kind of migrate into the other aspects of this. So I just want to say that the slave trade itself, here we've looked at it and we see that we need to expand our thinking about what that was and about who was impacted. Remember, only about 25% of the slave trade, the Africans who were traded into slavery, came to the United States, what today is the United States. The others, 75% went to South and Central America and the islands. That's why today the largest population of African people outside of Nigeria is in Brazil. Now in Brazil, because of their racial categorization system, that you might not think that, but if you categorize Africans there and look at the descendants of those who were enslaved in the same way we do here in the U.S., you'll see that population is huge, right? But their system of racial classification is very different. In part, their system was different because in their published side of it, they were suggesting they were trying to normalize or equalize things. But in terms of the way it's played out, if you talk to African people who are there now, people of African descent who are there now, that they are the poorest ones. They're the ones who live in the favelas. They're the ones who are on the lower side of the socioeconomic realm, least education. All of those types of things are still negatively impacting Africans in Brazil in the same way they impact us here. And so we have to think about who those people are and what the impact is. Okay, so when we put all those things in context, that gives us a little more insight into what the transatlantic slave trade is, how it transpired, and where we are now. I want to suggest that when we think about the transatlantic slave trade and its impact, that its impact had several different epochs, right? That at the end of the slave trade, when it became illegal, and the United States made it illegal to import slaves, and that slavery itself was illegal with the 13th Amendment, it didn't completely become illegal because it was still legalized for anybody who's imprisoned. So if you go back and look at the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, that we still legally have slaves in the United States if anyone is in prison, right? And so then that's still a problem, and there's a lot of people struggling today to get that language removed from the U.S. Constitution, from the 13th Amendment, because it opens the door for a particular type of treatment for people who are incarcerated. Another piece to kind of think about. And when we look at W.E.B. Du Bois, and we in my book, The Hidden Debate, I talk about that we have something called Gradations of Liberation, right? So that after 1865, when slavery was formally ended. Obviously, that happened in '63 with the Emancipation Proclamation, but the real impact of it happened in '65. That the United States still allowed for this system to go on, and after that ended, another thing that happened is that Africans thought that freedom for them meant the same thing as it meant for Europeans, right? So that they're European, and I say European. Some people say white. I say that this paper is white, and so I don't necessarily think those terminologies are accurate. This phone is black, but that these, if you read Frantz Fanon, he'll talk to you about the idea of whiteness and blackness is an idea of otherness, right? That those who are in power have the power to classify the other, and use that as a place of control and domination because of their position of power, and they use that to rule over others. And so he's suggesting to us that to utilize the terms black and white is problematic in that sense, because it continues to empower those who classify themselves as white, because white people didn't come to America as white. They came as Scottish and Welsh and Goths um, and Irish and Dutch and all these other things. That's how they came. They weren't Europeans. They became Europeans. Certain groups of Europeans were ostracized by the Anglo-Saxons, for instance. If you were Jewish, if you were Irish, if you were Italian, all were ostracized by the Anglo-Saxons. And so we don't talk about that much in history, though. But it's something that we need to be talking about. And then Africans didn't come as Africans, right? They came as um, uh, Yoruba and uh, I can't even think, Yoruba and Igbo, as Ga, and Fulani, and so many different other groups from which they came, because those ideas hadn't solidified yet in terms of the collective consciousness of the people on either side of the table. And so then we have to think about who those people are and what that meant for them, right? Uh, so let's kind of try to wrap this up here. The Europeans then are creating a system that they determined and classified what was for them a system of navigating the space that they were in, right? And that as they navigated that space, they created various stratas within there. And early on, not all Europeans were in the same strata. So some came as indentured servants and other things, but these Africans who were there, who came were mostly enslaved, even though there's some at different points in time who were free and or got free, or who were here already, some who lived further out west. All these kinds of things we oftentimes don't talk about when we're considering these points. But Du Bois, getting back to Du Bois asks us, what are we going to be doing? What's going to happen with these Africans who are now free? And what ended up happening is that they thought that they were going to have, and this is the point I was making before, the same freedoms as Europeans. And so that meant that when they saw themselves as getting free from being enslaved, that they had hoped and viewed that as being that they would have liberty, equality, and justice, right? But they didn't get those things. What they got was a new form of bondage, which oftentimes was worse than the first form of bondage that they have. So then that first one was sharecropping, right? And then after sharecropping started, then they had. I'm assuming you talked about that sharecropping in your class. They had peonage, right? And then this is when people who were in prison, they came with all kind of draconian laws and silly laws to just arrest African people and put them in jail for doing hard times. There's a great documentary on PBS. One of my students was in it. It's called Slavery by Another Name. If you get a chance, you should definitely check that out. That documentary helps you to understand what the process of enslavement was like after formal slavery, right? So what peonage and convict leasing was all about. And those became other kinds of places and things where that impacted folks in very, very negative ways. And so we have to say, well, they didn't have the freedoms that they thought they were going to be having, that they thought that they knew that they were entitled to, but the Europeans who formerly enslaved them were trying to find new ways to enslave them. And that's in fact what they did after Lincoln's assassination and the following president. Really, they reinstituted slavery in another form. And if you go back and you read what happened, you'll see a lot of that. There's a book called White Rage, very good book, talks about the impact of these changes and how they came about. Very detailed, great analysis. I suggest you look into that book. It'll provide some useful insights. So after that, then you have Jim Crow experience and segregation, forced segregation that happened in the South and throughout the country, and that's another level that they thought they should be free, but didn't get freedom. And so this keeps continuing, these gradations of liberation, and each one seems like you get a little less affronted by white supremacy, but white supremacy nonetheless, right? And so then we keep pushing, and then we ask the question about, well, what does that mean? What has that meant over the years? It's meant that once each layer of the liberation gets peeled back, that you have more freedoms to walk around. You can eat in the cafe next to Europeans. You can sit on the toilet next to people and all kinds of things. You can drink from the same water fountains. But still, we haven't changed the minds and the hearts of people, so racism still exists. White supremacy still exists. Hatred still exists. And so when you see those kinds of things happening, and some of you might not like this, but that's where you get the ideas that emerge from what Trump has done, right? That Trump has helped to emerge the ideas of the embedded nature in the United States of white supremacy rearing its head again, right? Because there was no need for the mask, right? The famous poem called "We Wear the Mask" talks about a mask that African people wore to navigate their space under the auspices of white supremacy. Well, Europeans wore a mask too, but their mask was different in terms of their masking their disdain for African people, but that disdain has surfaced in recent years. right? It's come back to a place where we can see that that level of hatred and disdain has played itself out in ways that has brought about conflict and consternation and political dichotomies that are deeper than just saying Democrat and Republican. And so when we think about those things and we begin to put them in context, we see how the moving into the idea about these current problems of we're talking about that maybe your class alludes to, that the current problems of race relations are still here, right? And so as a professor looking at and studying race relations for the last 20, 25, maybe more years, that we begin to see the how this is maybe even 30 years now has begun to play itself out in ways that it we can see that it hasn't disappeared, right? And that that the uh, uh, class account got reset. Oh, that we now are uh, confronted with this question about how do we move forward. We're confronted with this question. There's really no different than the question Du Bois raised in the early 1900s. I believe he first raised it at the Pan-African Conference in that was held in London in 1900, right? It was organized by Henry Sylvester Williams, who was from Trinidad, and Du Bois and a bunch of other folks were at this conference trying to talk about how do we unify people of African descent, particularly African countries, under the auspices of their unique, similar identity, their unique, similar problem. In that problems in that time, their problems were colonialism, the control and domination by Europeans. A few places, most of them were most of the countries in Africa at that time were under a colonial regime. Maybe with the exception of Ethiopia, and I'm sure I have to look back in 1900s, not too many other places would have been free. Ghana didn't get its freedom until 1957, right? And so some countries this year are celebrating their 50th and 60th celebration of independence. So when we think about the current problems, that these current problems are tied to this history of bondage and this history of gradations of liberation. And so what people are pushing back against is that the gradations are understood now to be another oppressive form, right? So that it's better to not be segregated and to have to worry about the clan every day you move. Somebody ended the governmental systems and the legislative, the legal system and the police and everybody in the system fighting against you in a very blatant, overt way, and not having very little recourse. And so then, the time during enslavement, the time during Jim Crow, the time during peonage, the time during convict leasing, all those things were very different than today. So are we glad that things have changed? Sure we are, but have they completely changed? And we have to say, well, maybe not, right? If you haven't read the book by, where is that book at? The New Jim Crow. There it is. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I suggest you check it out because she talks about that as we talk about the changes in time.
Please hold up the book. Let's see the book, please.
Okay, I'll have to turn my background off because it.
Oh,
Hold on,
I see. Okay.
hold on. I can just it'll be quick. So the New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, right? Great book. Suggest you read it.
Thank you.
You're welcome, no problem. And you have a bunch of other ones that I talked about. Here's one of Du Bois's. that we were looking at. This is the Boyce Encyclopedia. I have a piece in here on Pan-Africanism. This gives you a really good understanding of some of his ideas about Pan-Africanism and what's important about it, but also about him and his life and his contributions. Uh, so, uh, but I'll get a change of background now. um, this is so that when we think about the impact of some of these things, there's just such a wealth of resources out there, but there's such a wealth of challenges also. Maybe I don't want to say wealth. There's such a huge set of challenges, but what we have to develop is holistic solutions to those problems. So I've tried to provide some context about the looking broader at the impact of racism and white supremacy and the legacy of the gradations of liberation, and the idea that it seems like the gradations should be positive, but in fact they have a negative impact because they give you the illusion of liberation, but when you're really not free, right? And that you get some people who have great wealth, right? You have a lot of Africans who have great wealth, African Americans and others, but at the same time, the numbers of people impoverished is even greater. And so then the question becomes: is it an illusion that everybody has the ability to participate in society at the level of a Michael Jordan, right? How many people get through to that point? And is there a point at which that there's going to be more people who have, if there's not going to be systematic impact? And that's what we have to talk about. Dr. Leonard Jeffries always talks about we have to have systems analysis. And so in systems analysis, that means that we look at things and see that there is that there are systems in place to keep things the way they are. And that those things that are in place to keep things the way they are happen for the benefit of some people and to the disadvantage of others. And so in my book, in The Hidden Debate, I talk about who those advantages and disadvantages are for and why they transpire. The book is less about affirmative action. It's more about the understanding of divergent ideas about liberty, equality, and justice. Now, as we are moving towards the end of this, I want to move on into reparations and talk about how reparations and HR 40 are related. I'll just spend 2 seconds on the year of return real quick. So the year of return, here is an idea, once again, of the gradations of liberation, right? We're moving to the ability to go to Ghana, to go to other places. This really was an idea from the president of Ghana, and that we can go back and visit and purchase land, and some people are getting dual citizenship, and that we have the ability to carve out a different reality and a set of relationships with Africans on the continent. And I would say we're all Africans, right? That I'm an African who happens to be in America, because my great great grandmother was, or great 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 grandmother was enslaved, and her daughters and sons lived on plantations. But that we are here today in a different reality, but nonetheless impacted by that legacy. So the year of return is the idea of going back to the continent, to some people to live and some people to develop stronger ties and relationships with brothers and sisters there, so that we then can move beyond the confines of the things that bind us. And it wasn't just for Africans in America, but it was for African descendants around the world to come back. And so there's a great movement now. There's lots of people having discussions about Pan-Africanism again. And Pan-Africanism is this idea that African people, that we need to develop a United States of Africa, or that African people need to come together regardless if they're Jamaican or Haitian or Brazilian or Nigerian or Ghanaian or South African or Kenyan, that we need to work together and unite together. And so then a lot of folks are working towards that. But part of that is also developing a United States of Africa, right? So that there is a Africa under a single economy and a single government. So those things are out there. Some of that discussion is happening. It hasn't fully come to fruition, but it's been worked on ever since 1900, when Henry Sylvester Williams first had that first conference. Even before then, there were folks working on something called pan-Negroism, and that was even before. So that was before the 1900s. That was in 1800s. So how do we get all of this from where we are into the discussions about reparations and HR 40? Well, HR 40 is a bill that's about reparations, right? And reparations, we have to say, well, what is reparations about? Reparations in general is about repair, right? That we have to look at the harm that was done to African people, right? That Africans were raped, maimed, assassinated, near genocide, tortured, um, any other kinds of things you can imagine, right? People were skinned and burnt alive, right? Mothers' babies were snatched from their bellies. If you haven't been to the Blacks and Wax Museum in Maryland, you should go so that you can see some of those, see some of what happened, the experiences. You should watch a movie. Do I have a copy here? I don't. You should watch a documentary called Sankofa. It's not. It's a docudrama, is really what it is. But watch Sankofa if you haven't seen it. I'll put the name. I'll spell the name in the chat so you can look it up. But it was a documentary, a movie that was done by okay, I can't reply to everybody, so I'll just put it in the chat, and then Professor, you can send it to your students. A brother named Jeremiah, I believe it is, and he did a great docudrama, and that was really informative. It was if you haven't seen it, it came out, I believe, in the 80s, but it's still available, and it's a great watch. And then there's several others, but you can, and just to get another history of other things, if you've never seen what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? Go look up Black Wall Street. What happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma was a tragedy, right? Rosewood, if you haven't seen it, that's a movie, but Rosewood is another one that I would suggest that you check out. It was a Hollywood movie, but it was a great movie for understanding some of the impact of what happened to African people and why there needs to be a repair. And if you read the book, White Rage gives you more understanding as to why there needs to be a repair, why there needs to be reparations, and why now. Reparations should have been a long time ago. But that when you think about it, some people say, well, I didn't have anything to do with enslaving people. No, but everyone had benefited from that, right? That you benefit from the privilege of what enslavement, and think about our economy, right? The American economy is based on what I would call a slaveocracy, right? That is what the early economy was. That as a slaveocracy, it was an economy that was based on the free labor of millions of people. And that millions of people's labor didn't just benefit individual plantation owners. It benefited churches. Churches had slaves, had enslaved people. Colleges and universities had enslaved people, right? Presidents had enslaved people. The subsidiary, the adjacent benefits, right, of different organizations. If you look at the insurance industry, many of you might not know that the insurance companies insured slave ships. So that the way that these major insurance companies that existed from back in the 17 and 1800s got their wealth was through insuring slave transportation through the so-called Atlantic slave trade, right? Through the European slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean and other places. But enslaved people were insured the same way your car might be insured, right? So if your car gets damaged, you get it replaced, and you get a check for it. So that if all the cargo, enslaved people, Africans, didn't get to the other side of the ocean, then the shipper or the whoever commissioned the ship would still get paid. And there you have, when most of the cargo made it, that meant that the insurance companies made money. That's where they make profit. They make profit when the things that they insure don't happen. If you're paying for term life insurance and you pay for 10 years, you get a 10-year term life insurance and you don't die, then they've capitalized on all the money that you've paid. They only have to, they're bargaining that you're not going to die. And unfortunately, we're bargaining that we're going to die, because that's when our insurance benefit pays us. We're betting that our car is going to get hit in an accident. They're betting that your car is not going to get hit in an accident, because the longer you don't get in an accident, the more profit they make. The more you insure your refrigerator and it keeps longer and longer, the more money they make. If your refrigerator goes bad, that's not a good thing for them. They want your refrigerator to last longer, right? So that's the process of insurance. And they ensured that enslaved people got to the other side. The property of the investors got to the other side. So that these are all the places we can think about the impact of enslavement. And so then if we really want to bring about healing in this country, because the thing that the country suffers from is trauma, right? Trauma from slavery, trauma from Jim Crow, trauma from convict leasing, trauma from so many things. And if we really want to heal, then we have to address the trauma. There's a great book out there also. Nope, don't have it here. There's a great book called My Grandmother's Hands. Look that book up. Great book. My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Healing our bodies and our hearts, or our bodies and our minds, or something like that. That book is excellent, because it helps us to understand that trauma is generational, and that it's not just African people who've been traumatized, but Europeans who've been traumatized. And so all of the traumatized people have been impacted by this. And that trauma is something that we need to look at to figure out how we overcome, how do we heal ourselves. And I'm making the argument that reparations is part of that healing process, because it's a compensation. First of all, it's a personalized recognition that there was something that was vile that was done. Right, somebody's mother was raped, and so now the slave master has an offspring, right, who was property. So think about this. This has to be trauma. That what's her name? Joy DeGruy talks about. She has a book called Joy DeGruy is. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. And in there, she's talking about how when we look at the idea of what's happened for enslaved people, that they've been traumatized, but they also that they're dealing with cognitive dissonance. And that's what Europeans did, right? That they had, if you study the word in psychology, cognitive dissonance, cognitive dissonance is that you distance yourself from reality, right? So reality is here, you distance yourself from that reality. I'm trying to put my hands in there so you can see them. You distance yourself from the reality. And so to distance themselves from the reality of the humanization of Africans is that they said Africans were not humans, right? They were savages, that they had all these other kind of names associated with them, that indigenous people, Native Americans, were not humans, that they were savages. And so that they weren't, and because they weren't baptized, and baptizing helped to humanize them, but it didn't make them full humans, right? So that these things were really their cognitive dissonance for the trauma that they were inducing into themselves. Think about that they would take children to a lynching, and this child now has to normalize watching a person screaming and yelling and being brutalized, but they're taught to laugh and to think that it's funny to see a African person to be lynched and skinned and burned, and that Europeans would then send postcards around. There's a whole history of postcards being sent around as part of this, right? So reparations is healing. You have to have reparations to address to repair the harm that was caused. That's not the totality of it. Reparations is only part of it, right? So HR 40 is a bill that's arguing for a commission. It's only arguing for a commission. It's saying that we need to have a commission that's paneled for a year or so, 18 months, to study how reparations should be meted out, how reparations, to whom should get reparations and why. And my problem with HR 40 is that it has a couple of holes in it. I think that it has some benefit, but it has some holes in it. One is that the international, that reparations discussions needs to be internationalized. That is, that reparations needs in the United States need to be talking about not just the United States government, but the corporations in the United States that benefited, the universities that benefited, the families that benefited, and the external Spain and France and international companies that benefited, that impacted Africans living in America. There's countries, I think Jamaica and some other countries in South and Central America and in Africa, who are already having discussions about reparations. And I think we need to add their discussions to the dialogue that's happening or is planned to happen here in the United States. Then we'll have a wider, give me 2 seconds, my battery is about to run out. We'll have a wider discussion about how that should transpire. So I think that becomes the key for how we do this, is that we contextualize our discussion in concert. Give me 2 seconds. I'm turning this light back on. There we go. All right, light's not coming back on. But anyway, that we look at the movement of reparations from the context of its international impact. And when we do so, I think that that's going to give us another way of understanding how we come to understand. There we go. Another way to look at what reparations is and how it first of all, that it's beneficial, and second of all, that it's not only beneficial but is necessary. The other piece that I think is missing from HR 40, so the first piece, HR 40 is a legislation adopted by the House of Representatives that has not gone out to the Senate, so it's never really been fully voted on, but it's a piece of legislation that John Conyers and others, not John Lewis and others have worked on. But I think the main thing is that it's trying to say that we need to have a consideration for reparations and to fully bring it into fruition. The last piece on HR 40, I'm arguing, is that we need to have reparations for African people needs to be looked at for that all African Americans should have free college education up to a bachelor's. And we know that Africans were forcefully, that is by the federal government, by the states, by the county, and by custom, by folkways and mores, that it was taboo actually for Africans to read and write, right? That they thought that an African who could read or write was dangerous, right? And so therefore that they most often tried to keep people, even Europeans, could be punished if they were caught teaching people of African descent to write and to read. And so knowing your letters and numbers was illegal. And then they, even to keep schools segregated, even if you go to look at Maryland, when you read the book White Rage, you'll see in the book that it talks about how in Prince George County in Maryland, they shut the school system down just so that Africans couldn't go to school with Europeans, right? that is whites and blacks. And so we have to think about those things and say that when we see the impact and the legacy of that, even in New Jersey is still one of the most segregated school systems in the United States. When we look at all this information, we begin to see that yeah, we need to do something about education. And I would argue that what we need to do is that one of the equalizing things is that African Americans should have free education up to a bachelor's. And I have a whole process about the payment of that, and it's not as expensive as you think it might be. But we can look into those things. But I see we're at 4:49. I probably could go on for another hour, so I'm gonna cut it here and say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Khalfani. Let's give him a round of applause. If you go to your reaction button, you can thumbs up or hand clap. And I would like to invite, let's see what's happening here. Oh, okay. I would like to invite the class for quick comments or reactions or questions to Professor Khalfani's discussion today on Bill HR 40 and reparations. The floor is open. Any comments, questions, or reactions? You can unmute your mics. Well, I guess we have a shy class. Professor Khalfani, I know you were running recently as a congressional candidate. Can you maybe share a little bit, if it's not too much to ask, how, during your campaign, you implemented or at least try to get a couple of your, or, other maybe Congress members to pass this HR 40 bill to send it to the Senate? Is there a movement? Is there a committee? I mean, how, because this has been in existence for a couple of years now, but up till now, nothing has really been done. So what is stopping it? The committee that is being worked on, has it stopped in terms of getting people to actually review and revise and maybe add on to what is currently on there? And how do we move this forward into the Senate?
Yeah, there are a group of folks who are working to push this. The hope is that that a lot of people have is that Biden will take it up, because they all during the campaign had suggested that they would, but excuse me, whether or not they actually do is another thing. I think that people can write their senators, they can write their Congress people, they can write the president, and their local elected officials. Right, there was one municipality that passed a reparations bill. I think it was Allenville or something like that, and they passed they were the first municipality in the United States to pass a legislation in support of reparations. And so, they're going to look into ways that they can do it, and other municipalities can do the same, right? And then counties can do the same, states can do the same, and then that gets rolled up into the federal government so that they can all put pressure on the federal government to implement these kinds of measures. But in terms of what folks who are there, I mean, as running for Congress, that each person who's running has different platform issues, and I would say not all of my colleagues took it up the same way that I did.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments for Professor Khalfani?
I just want to ask the same question that.
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Joseph November. I'm one of the students, but I'm really late in the class because I have a problem to connect to Zoom. But I just want to ask the same question that the professor just asked about reparation. I know it's still a debate in the United States, but it's also in the world for the African diaspora, even in Africa. Professor, do you know that the United States is always against reparation for the slaves especially in the Caribbean and in Africa? They're against it because the last meeting that they had, with I forgot that whoever was the secretary at the time. That was Bush, one of the Bush administration. He was a black man representing the country. He was against it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but there's been, of course, there's been opposition to reparations. And first of all, I think you were not here, but I want to just clarify that the use of the terminology slaves, that people weren't slaves, they were enslaved,
Yes.
and that you know, when we call our ancestors slaves, that we further dehumanize them. So
Yes.
I caution you against that kind of terminology.
I'm
But
sorry.
no need to apologize. But the point is just that in terms of uh, us moving to a place where that's why I said in the beginning, we have to internationalize the discussion on reparations that's not currently in HR 40, is because that dialogue has already been going on the continent, in the islands, in South and Central America.
Yeah, I just want to add something according to or in relation with the reparation question problem, that I'm a little shocked when I see Black American in the United States and the Haitian Revolution. When I'm out talking to them, and especially people who should supposed to know, they don't establish any kind of relationship between the Haitian Revolution and the Black struggle in the United States. That's something I don't understand.
Well, I would say that that's not 100% true. That we have to be careful about making broad brush statements, because there's a whole group of folks,
Yeah.
myself included,
Yes.
who are keenly aware of the Haitian struggle and understand its impact. In fact, there's an African American brother, who made a documentary called 1804. That is a great documentary that talks about the impact of the Haitian Revolution, and brings up some information on different set of characters who were involved that most people don't talk about. So whether you're talking about Dessalines and Toussaint and Bookman and others, that you know, that all those people, that was the impact of a lot of the other liberation movements that happened in the United States. Whether you're talking about Denmark Vesey or others, that these things were inspired by the Laura of what happened in Haiti. And then Haiti also had a huge impact in South and Central America, because they were engaged in helping them to get free from being enslaved. So if you go study the liberation movement from enslavement in South America, you'll see that Haiti had a huge impact.
No, I agree. I agree. But myself, it just, I don't feel I would say, some kind of strong relationship between the Black struggle and the society that we live, and the Haitian struggle and the Caribbean, because of what Haiti present after being the first enslaved country to be independent in the Caribbean.
First is the only.
The only one, yes, the only one. And when you see the present problem that Haiti is dealing with since the beginning of the independence, since 1804, and the embargo on for 60 years from the United States, and also all the struggle from the invasion in 1915 and until now, the interference of the United States and the politics of Haiti. I don't feel the relationship between the Black society in here and the struggle of the Haitian society. I mean, the Haitian struggle in terms of how they fight together, and then the two. Because yes.
I got you. But I think that what you're missing is that it's a two-way street, right?
Yes.
And that is that it's both from the Haitian side and the African American side, but it's not just the Haitian and African American. That's why the folks have been pushing for Pan-Africanism, because it's Haiti and Jamaica and Guyana and Ghana and Nigeria and Chad and African Americans and Canadian Africans and
Yeah.
British Africans. And so that once we realize that our collective networking and building together is something that we have to foster, then we we can be successful in that. But I think the other piece that I didn't hear you mention that is a tremendous, is probably the primary impact of the Haitian impoverishment and other negative impacts is France, right? So that the French threatened or forced Haiti to pay millions of dollars after they won their freedom. And that was reparations for France. What reparations was it? It was reparations for France for the land and the slaves that they lost. So they had a kind of a negative reparations that France got based on its imposition, and it used its military and the United States as tools to enforce the payment of that. And then Haiti didn't finish paying that back until recent times.
100 years. They spent 100 years to pay for all that
I
money.
understand. So I'm saying that taking that length of time to pay that back and its national wealth going to France for that many years meant that it was going to be an impoverished country, and that you can't just automatically now come to a place where you've been paying millions and millions and millions of dollars to another country for years instead of investing in your own people for the threat of invasion. What could Haiti do? And then that's why Haiti is poor today.
No, but I understand that. But the thing is, don't forget, the time that Haiti was being forced to pay that money, we have the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States, the first thing is for the European powers not to interfere in the Caribbean or the Americas politics, and also not to have new colony. But United States protect Dominican Republic to not to pay the same kind of debt that the Germans want the United States Dominican Republic to pay. But Haiti, they didn't give the support. They just let French do it and get the money. You know.
But I mean, we're going all over the place. But I would just say that's no different than any strategies of divide and conquer that Europeans have been using for many, many years. And so that you're speaking of how that different European countries, including the United States, have used their sovereignty, their power, their military for their own personal gains. And when you begin to look at their own personal and or capital gains, and the gains for the people who are in power in those countries, then you begin to see that the things that you're saying, talking about, play themselves out, and they play themselves out over and over again in different parts of the world.
No, but
Yes, thank you.
you.
Let's see if another person has any comments or questions, because we have to round up, so that we can start office hours. Do you have any other comments or questions? And don't forget, I'm gonna post the link for this discussion on the group class page on Blackboard. And Professor Khalfani, if you don't mind, would you like to type in your contact information in the chat room? Well, actually, I will send it to them. I do have it. I realize you can't do, message to everybody. So if you don't mind, I'm going to forward them your contact information. I'll post that on the group page so that
I'll
if
send you the
they're
contact information that you can forward to them.
okay, sure. And then, feel free to be in touch with him. So Professor Khalfani, in respect of time and also for your other commitments, do you have any last words or any roundup concluding remarks that you have?
I would just say that, first of all, thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for your students for listening in. And I wish you the best as you wrap up your semester. I would just say continue to investigate and to make sure that as a sociologist, one of the things that we do is that we question the obvious, right? But then also we're investigators. We want to, sometimes we have to just step back and listen to what the others are saying, so that we can kind of amass an understanding of what's going on, even though we may not agree with it. But then we begin to see the diverse understandings of and interpretations of the world in which we live, and then we can use our tools of analysis to come to some understanding of it. So I would suggest that everybody go out there and talk to people, listen to people, so that you can um, amass some more understanding of people's perspectives and ideas, and then and not have to be in competition with them, but to hear them, so that you can begin to use that knowledge to see the world differently, because there's so many iterations of the world that we understand, as we understand it, that we couldn't hope to grasp them all. But there's always new knowledge, new information for us to capitalize on, to utilize. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give Professor Khalfani another round of applause through the reaction button. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. And for the students that stayed on, thank you very much. Professor Khalfani, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for the education, the discussion, the dialogue, and sharing, your perspective. We wish you continued success in your congressional pursuit, and also with your research. And we'll be in touch. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Professor, can I ask